Hello, everybody. I believe we are now live. And as we see people join the webinar, I'll take a moment just to share some general housekeeping rules that we're very happy for people to share questions. In fact, we encourage it. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of the call, so please feel free to send those questions in. There is a question button. Feel free to use it. And what we will also be doing is sharing a couple of links on the chat. Please feel free to click on those links. It will be to obviously Verdantix or to Mitiga Solutions. Very happy for you to ask us any questions with regards to either of those topics. But today's topic is obviously around climate risk due diligence for investors. And we here at Mitiga Solutions are very happy to be joined and to be helped out by Verdantix. In the form of our good friend, Alice Saunders. Alice, potentially, if it's all right with you, if I can just hand over to you to talk through who Verdantix are and yourself, and we can get started with the presentation.
Of course. Thank you very much, John. So a little bit about Verdantix. We are a research and advisory firm with expertise in net zero and climate risk and ESG and sustainability, amongst other practice areas. Next slide, please. And I'm Alice Saunders. I'm an industry analyst in the net zero and climate risk practice I mentioned. My research agenda focuses primarily on climate risk, scenario analysis, and climate risk digital solutions. And thanks for everyone tuning in today. It's really my pleasure to be here on this webinar. I wanted to start firstly by looking at some of the broader context about the regulatory environment and the physical environment to kind of set the scene on why should organizations assess and manage climate risks. Next slide, please. So with this slide, I wanted to show the global nature of the climate disclosures that are rolling out over the next few years. In the navy text here, I've listed countries and regions that have current mandated or planned climate disclosures. And then in the electric blue are countries and regions with climate disclosures still in development. So focusing on APAC here, so climate disclosures have come into effect in 2023 and 2022, primarily for financial institutions in New Zealand, the Philippines, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, and additionally, over the next few years, there are proposed disclosures for Australia, Hong Kong, South Korea, and wider reaching disclosures in Singapore as well that should come into effect. Equally, not only is there a wide geographical spread here, but these disclosures are also requiring a lot of granularity. So, for example, the EU CSRD that's coming into effect this year, that will require a total of 49,000 European firms and at least 10,000 firms outside of the EU to disclose climate-related data. EFRAG have recently released the data points, and there are 221 that are climate change related. So I think that just really demonstrates not only the geographical scope in terms of the amount of firms that are going to be required to make climate disclosures or are already required, but also the granularity of these disclosures. Next slide, please. So not only is there a need to consider physical climate risks due to these regulatory requirements, but there's also a financial incentive. So I've put on screen here some statistics to really show the escalating severity and cost of extreme weather events over the last few years. So as you can see in the middle here, around 52.3 billion euros was the cost in economic losses to assets in the EU in 2022 due to weather and climate-related extremes. And there's a similar number in Asia Pacific, around $57 billion in losses. I've also put up the statistic here of the amount of people that were affected just to really show the scope and the scale of these climate events and natural catastrophes that are only escalating due to climate change. I also wanted to show here with this statistic on the far right about how this has been growing over the past several years. So this statistic of 133 billion, this is Verisk's latest estimate of what natural catastrophes will cause on average in insured losses per year. Now, this is compared to an average of 100 billion in actual insured losses over the past 5 years and 70 billion in the previous 5 years before that. So I think that really demonstrates how not only are extreme weather events becoming costly, but this has really been escalating and will continue to do so. Next slide, please. So how does this apply to private equity firms? How is this relevant? Next slide, please. So there are 3 factors here. First of all, climate impacts can influence the value of a portfolio in the medium and the long term by disrupting portfolio company operations and damaging assets. So what do I mean here? Real estate investors, for example, due to sea level rise or higher flood risk exposure, this can decrease property values. Equally, climate risk and climate events can have an impact on firms' bankruptcy. So there's the example of PG&E that weren't prepared for climate events and how the climate would change. And private equity firms can be exposed to instances like these in their investee companies. Equally, supply chain disruptions caused by climate events. So, for example, if ports are closed and there's transport failures or crop failures, for example, that can also disrupt and cause an impact on a firm's portfolio. Secondly, what I have here is stakeholder demands. So stakeholders are asking for better climate risk management and transparency. Pension funds, for example, are asking for climate risk data either to fulfill their own disclosures or to align with their strategy. And industry groups are asking for this too. So, for example, the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, Sarah's Investor Network on Climate Risk. And they're asking for really relevant, consistent, and comparable climate data. And finally here, what I've already talked about at the start, regulated and voluntary reporting. So not only do mandatory climate disclosures primarily apply to financial services firms, but also financial services firms may be making voluntary reporting in line with the ISSB. On Finance Day, for instance, in COP28, 140 companies representing 120 trillion in assets signed a statement of support for the ISSB standards. Firms already are adopting the ISSB standards on a voluntary basis, and there are also calls to make reporting alongside the ISSB mandatory by as soon as 2025. So there's really a range of reasons here why this is relevant for private equity firms. Next slide, please. But what would this look like in practice? So I wanted to show here exactly what this would include. So with these overarching bubbles at the top, I wanted to show these aspects that would kind of cover the whole process. And then with the arrows, looking at each step of the investment cycle, and then at a longer term scale. So first of all, analysing climate risks for private equity firms would mean establishing a management structure and teams that are responsible for this. So this would be to ensure accountability, to make sure that it doesn't get added to someone's already large plate of things to do, to make sure that this actually gets done, doesn't get left on the wayside. Equally, determining a climate strategy. So this would mean that you would be establishing thresholds or a particular portfolio plan, figuring out what particular industries you want to allocate capital to make sure that you can then apply this across the organization and reduce risk exposure, as I mentioned earlier. So at the due diligence stage, what would this mean? This would mean assessing the projected impacts of climate risks before acquiring an investee firm. So along with your usual due diligence processes, also incorporating looking at the climate risk exposure that would be taken on board by investing in a firm and adding them to your portfolio. Next, in the hold and post-hold period. So this would entail assessing risks expected to arise during that period or in the period after divestment, as this may impact sale price. And from this, you can then establish thresholds for engagement or alter your divestment strategy. So it's not just that you can kind of tick off climate risk assessment just in the due diligence process, but also continually assessing this and returning to this to make sure that you're not exposed to further risks over the period of your investment. And then finally, as I mentioned with that climate strategy, a long-term portfolio alignment with your climate-related goals and targets. Next slide, please. So now I've spoken about why should financial services firms consider climate risk, why should they manage and assess climate risks, and what that looks like. Now I want to cover what the current state of play is and what challenges financial services firms are facing that is preventing them or causing obstacles to their assessment of climate risks. Next slide, please. So here I've included some data from our global corporate survey. This is a survey that Verdantix does every year, and we speak to heads of sustainability, heads of net zero, climate executives. This graph is a cut of just our financial services respondents, so that's about 47 respondents. Usually our survey in total is around 350, 400. What I wanted to draw your attention to here is the significant proportion of respondents that don't know what the financial impacts of extreme weather events will be for their firm. So, which is approximately about 41% of financial services respondents. Equally, 27% anticipated that they expect no losses over the next 3 years. With this, I really wanted to highlight the sheer number of firms that aren't even considering climate risk. It's not really on their radar. It's not something incorporated into their due diligence processes or their organization as a whole, which, considering the statistics I showed earlier, shows that there's a real gap here in terms of the amount of insured losses, the impact of extreme weather events, and the impacts that organizations are expecting here. Obviously, with these things, like, for example, with our regional splits, there are geographical swings on the losses expected. For example, North American leaders expected greater losses from hurricanes, and in APAC, they anticipated greater losses from floods and storms. Of course, there are these regional changes, but what I really wanted to point out is the number of firms that really aren't looking at this yet. Next slide, please. And with this data, so on the left, this is from the survey I just described, and on the right is from a more recent survey. This was around 33 financial services respondents. But from this, I really wanted to show, okay, well, exactly why aren't financial services firms considering climate risks? Why aren't they evaluating their exposure? So as you can see on the left here, 26% of respondents said that insufficient internal expertise was very challenging when they were looking to use climate risk modelling and analysis to inform their strategy development. So insufficient internal expertise came up as the biggest issue here in our global survey. And then equally in our more recent survey on the right here, other issues that really came up as obstacles was lack of data availability and the logistical burden of data collection and aggregation, as you can see at the top here, with over 30% of respondents indicating that this is a significant obstacle to them. Next slide, please. So I've showed you this survey data with organizations saying, okay, this is why we're struggling to do climate risk analysis. These are the challenges we're facing. But what's behind these challenges? First of all, skills shortages. So climate risk related expertise is often associated with research organizations or was in the realm of academia. Equally, trying to hire in staff that have both that expertise in business and in the particular industry you're working in, as well as climate expertise, is a real challenge for organizations, which is contributing to these skills shortages, especially as climate risk analysis does require a layer of expertise to unpick exactly what climate scenarios are, and it's often at quite different timescales or with a different approach to what risk managers are used to. Equally on here, tight budgets and small teams. You may have seen in the previous slide that budget concerns was a top obstacle. This comes up again and again in our surveys, as small teams, especially sustainability teams, often have a very large remit and not many staff members to actually enact this. So often, even in the larger organizations that have a significant amount of money, just because of the team members and the scale of the endeavor, often feel like they're really struggling in budget to enact these changes and to incorporate climate risk, especially in the current economic climate when perhaps more sustainability related aspects take a back foot. Equally, those challenges with data availability. So organizations are really struggling with lack of data from investee firms, with either investee firms not already having done their own climate risk analysis that private equity firms can then use, or even getting the geographical locations from investee firms so that they can perform, as the private equity firm, their own analysis. This back and forth is just a real struggle with data availability for organizations. And then the last one I've put on here also about data is that kind of data and process overwhelm, especially if organizations are already looking to calculate their emissions portfolio, calculate their emissions footprint of their portfolio, or, for example, have other sustainability metrics they're gathering. Just the real requirement of data, the logistical challenges of back and forth is overwhelming, especially small teams. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up here on the key takeaways of what I've gone through so far. First of all, private equity firms should assess climate risks and incorporate this across the organization. So this includes within their due diligence practices, as well as these overarching changes. Secondly, as shown in our survey results, nearly half of surveyed financial services firms aren't assessing their exposure to physical climate risks. And then finally, financial services firms are facing challenges with lack of data and internal expertise, and that's hindering their climate risk analysis and management efforts. And with that, I'd like to hand back over to John.
Thanks, Alice. And honestly, for anybody who's joined today's call, I would really encourage you to join as many of the Verdantix webinars as possible. I certainly learn a lot every time I listen in, but I also had the opportunity to be able to join their in-person events at the end of November, beginning of December last year, and really, really appreciated the insight that they were able to provide into not just climate risk, but also net zero, and how as many different organizations really need to push this onto their sustainability agenda for 2024. So today, on behalf of Matiga Solutions, I'm excited to share insights into EarthScan, which is our premier platform, and delve into one of its primary use cases, due diligence. Joining me is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Gillian McCusker, a seasoned climate scientist with a decade of experience in the field of climate science. Together, we're here to shed light on how EarthScan aids our customers in discovering, analysing, and acting upon climate risks and opportunities for their assets. Before we dive into EarthScan's capabilities, let's take a moment to define due diligence in the context of our platform. And we break it down into 3 different categories, some of which have already been mentioned by Alice herself: disclosure, external, and internal due diligence. Our disclosures align with the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which as of last year was absorbed by the ISSB, and CSRD rules, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, now integrated into various laws globally. Our EarthScan platform assists in navigating these regulations, making the climate risk analysis section of the EU Taxonomy, TCFD, and CSRD more accessible and manageable for you. External reporting is also crucial for stakeholders and investors alike. We're here to help you weave climate risk analysis seamlessly into your annual reports, sustainability reports, or other public-facing platforms that you so choose. But perhaps most importantly, EarthScan plays a pivotal role in internal due diligence. It allows thorough analysis of climate risks associated with any asset you're considering acquiring or divesting from. This internal scrutiny ensures that climate considerations are integrated into your everyday business processes. Another term that I'd like to define is scenario analysis, because scenario analysis and climate risk go hand in hand, especially when you're discussing disclosure, but also when you're doing your due diligence for your assets. So let's define what we mean by scenario analysis. It involves evaluating climate-related risks and opportunities by considering various future scenarios. EarthScan facilitates this by offering 3 distinct scenarios: business as usual, emissions peak in 2040, and Paris aligned. They are all aligned to the IPCC's AR6 shared socioeconomic pathways, as shared on the graph here on screen. Climate scenarios provide critical information for decision makers. We've already heard about how climate change is uncertain, and due to that uncertainty, policy decisions and human activity will impact future greenhouse gas emissions. Experts advise using a range of scenarios to assess climate risk. This is because climate scenarios are designed to take into account uncertainties around both future human activity and policy decisions. By examining multiple scenarios simultaneously, decision makers can account for multiple possible outcomes. What is the purpose of climate scenarios? Well, the purpose is to support and inform decisions that anticipate climate change impacts. They're an important part of the creation and adoption of strategies to mitigate to and adapt to climate risk. Each climate scenario in EarthScan represents a potential climate future and can be used to support strategic planning and decision making. They are projections of future greenhouse gas emissions used as part of climate risk assessments to explore the potential impacts of climate change under different socioeconomic conditions. Climate scenario analysis is essential for climate risk assessments, as climate risk is being driven by changing conditions in Earth's climate. Analysis based only on historic data as benchmarks alone is not suitable for climate risk because they don't account adequately for dramatic large-scale change or future surprises that are inherent to climate risk. If we knew the future, we would tell you the lottery numbers. Now, moving forward, EarthScan aligns with major climate frameworks, including the TCFD, ISSB, and more. It aids in identifying short, medium, and long-term climate-related risks and provides insights on various scenarios. Additionally, we offer a screening service for up to 5,000 assets with plans to expand and integrate with external tools through an API. The EU Taxonomy and CSRD present specific challenges, but EarthScan simplifies the process. We focus on 11 critical climate risk hazards, tailoring our analysis to our built environment, be it industrial, commercial, or residential. Now, let's explore how EarthScan incorporates climate risk analysis both internally and externally through a case study that we've undertaken with a customer over the course of the last 18 months. We here at Matiga Solutions have worked extensively with asset management firms and real estate investors to assist them with their climate change due diligence. Why is it important for them to share their interest publicly? Firstly, by sharing their due diligence process, investors demonstrate transparency. Transparency builds trust between investors and other stakeholders, such as founders, co-investors, and the broader community. It helps create an honest and open relationship, showcasing the investor's commitment to thorough and fair assessments. Additionally, there's internal educational value. This is one of the points highlighted by Alice earlier, that people don't have the internal expertise to be able to tackle climate risk analysis. But we have worked with multiple industries where they have shared EarthScan's insights throughout their business. What this achieves in whichever business is utilizing EarthScan is the overall investment in the risk reduction of climate change. Firstly, through mitigation measures, such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but secondly, through adaptation. We've worked with multiple customers that have taken key investment decisions surrounding climate change into consideration, such as where best to place energy infrastructure with regards to flood risk, or when will it be necessary for my assets to withstand maximum temperatures of 30, 35, or even 40 degrees plus here in the UK. With regards to external due diligence, finally and potentially most importantly, it is necessary for investors to share their approach to risk mitigation. By sharing due diligence approaches with other investors, the overall investor community benefits. Suddenly, we can exist in a world that takes into consideration the long-term financial, social, and environmental costs on the investments we make. This can only be seen in a positive light. Where internal due diligence is concerned, process makes perfect. When EarthScan is first utilized by an investor, their primary focus will be their existing portfolio. So for investors, we recommend screening your existing portfolio, identifying those at-risk assets, and generating adaptation or mitigation plans. Unless the risk is so catastrophic, it's unlikely you're going to start divesting. Therefore, it is important for the investor and indeed for all stakeholders and shareholders that appropriate risk mitigation and adaptation plans take place. Think greenhouse gas reduction and think heat stress and flood defences. After using EarthScan for their standing portfolio, it's our strong recommendation that the platform is used for pre-transaction due diligence as part of your standard operating procedure. Pre-transaction due diligence is crucial, ensuring you invest wisely and consider potential climate risks before acquiring new assets. With the insights provided by EarthScan, you can assess the likelihood of up to 6 different risk categories and the impacts they could have on your investment. With these insights, you can start to make scientifically informed business-critical decisions in seconds. EarthScan goes beyond scenarios, due diligence, and disclosure. It provides custom insights, drilling down with custom fields and timelines of up to 2100 for those long-life assets. With over 500 million discoverable assets worldwide, EarthScan is truly a global platform offering insights from Seattle to Auckland. EarthScan is not just about climate scenarios, however. It's about empowering you to analyse, report, and act on those climate risks and opportunities facing your assets. Now, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Gillian McCusker to discuss the science behind EarthScan and emphasise the global nature of the climate challenge we all face. Thank you, and over to you, Gillian.
Thank you, John. So, you have heard thus far about the mounting financial toll of extreme weather events around the world. You have heard about what businesses like you are doing to meet the climate risk due diligence needs for their investments. You have heard that those regulators are setting the gold standard of what you need to do to understand how the climate will affect you in your business activities. What I want to talk to you about now is how. And this all comes back to the core issue. The climate is changing. We are entering an era of climate shocks and stresses that our built environment has never experienced before, and for which it is likely ill-adapted. For businesses around the world, it is a matter of when, not if, climate comes to the agenda. But let's acknowledge the magnitude of this challenge. Future climate change is not black and white, and there is much that scientists don't fully understand. Researchers worldwide are working to push the boundaries of human understanding so that policymakers and decision makers can prepare appropriately for what could be coming our way. Scientists don't know everything, but we know enough, and knowing what could likely come to pass in the context of the range of possible outcomes and with quantified uncertainty is key to building resilience across your business. And this is a global problem. A global problem which requires a global solution. You need a solution which integrates climate science expertise, advanced statistical modelling, and research-grade, reputable third-party climate datasets into a decision-useful single source of truth of climate hazard probability worldwide. You need to be able to open that black box and understand how A plus B has equaled C. And this is what EarthScan can do for you. High quality climate data are the backbone to everything that we do. However, as Alice mentioned, these data sets are siloed, they're disparate, they can be hard to manage due to their size, and they are simply not fit for purpose in their naked form for pre-transaction due diligence, for portfolio resiliency assessments, and for the wave of mandatory financial disclosures faced by businesses across the world. EarthScan acknowledges these challenges and simplifies the data landscape. Built on an innovative, proprietary multivariate statistical framework, EarthScan combines these disparate data into that single source of truth, which is efficient and scalable, while also being transparent and methodical. This integrated solution is then layered onto an expansive asset database and a sophisticated global ratings framework to translate climate hazard probability to decision-useful, actionable information, culminating in the climate insights that you can see on EarthScan today. And this is not static. This framework enables an evolving methodology that works to improve and refine climate hazard information across the world so that you can continue to have access to the state of the art. EarthScan empowers you to quickly analyse, report and act on your physical climate risk. It gives you the toolkit to upskill yourself and your team to become climate champions so that you can become that in-house expert that these assessments so sorely require. So get ahead of climate change. Build it into your business as usual. Prepare yourself for what could be coming. Show your stakeholders that you are future-proofing your investments. Show them with EarthScan. If you would like to know more, please feel free to book in your personalised EarthScan demo with our experts through the Montega Solutions website link that John will be sharing in the chat shortly. For now, I would like to say thank you on behalf of Alice, John and myself, and would like to open the floor to any questions you may have.
Thanks, Gillian. I will be posting that in just a second in the chat screen there. We have had our first question through, which I will take my an initial answer to. But Alice, Gillian, if you feel free to add in any points which you feel you may want to. So it's from Kieran, and the question is, have we found the issues around financial firms integrating physical climate risk have come as a consequence of typical silo issues? ESG teams not effectively communicating with their other departments, etc., despite the company's interest. So I think first and foremost, it's got to be mentioned that there are lots of financial firms out there that are already doing a great job of integrating physical climate risk and sharing it internally to create that educational value. Having said that, the way that Montega Solutions and EarthScan works with physical climate risk as a product, as it were, is we take a customer success approach as almost a SaaS approach, if you will. The idea behind that is to onboard people who we recognize are not immediately going to be experts within climate change. So that's the first thing. We always take the head of ESG, head of sustainability along with us. But more importantly, we encourage the financial firms we work with to create climate champions throughout their annual license. The point of this is to ensure that people from the finance team, from the legal team, understand the requirements that are made of them, especially those that are mandatory, because they can result in fines. So it's really important that you don't take this as a silo issue. I would imagine that ESG teams being accused of not effectively communicating with their other departments, they've got so many things on their plate, of which climate risk is another one, but net zero often gets the main focus. What I would suggest to them is that you've got to start planning for climate risk now, as it's not only a mandatory disclosure, but also you may well feel the financial effects of climate change if you don't start to take action soon. I don't know, Alice, Gillian, if you wanted to add anything to that answer.
That was a great response, John. The only thing I would just quickly add would be, I think, especially with trying to assess climate risk, that collaboration with the risk team and the sustainability team can often prove a bit of a challenge, as John mentioned, with silo communication, etc. So that almost adds just another layer to the complication with additional stakeholders and logistics.
Fantastic. Yes, we've had, I think one of the challenges that customers often find is surrounding climate data. So I think, Gillian, it might be worth suggesting what data sources power EarthScan and how that can be a source of trust for EarthScan as well.
Absolutely, thank you. So as John mentioned, we have these 6 independent hazard categories on EarthScan that layer up into what's called a combined physical risk category. But none of these single hazards that sit underneath that are driven by a single data source. Each leverages a combination of different data with different strengths to build a representative perspective on how that hazard might change into the future. And those data sources which are selected are those which are very much the most applicable or the most useful in terms of decision making for that hazard in question. So for an example, if we take heat or drought, we use data from the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project Phase 6. So this is a very reputable global intercomparison project using global climate models, which the data for this particular project was very much the key data source that informed the latest IPCC sixth assessment report that came out in stages over the past few years. So this is very much the backbone of that heat and drought signal, as these take into account those state-of-the-art climate models that are global climate models that are available to us. There's a different perspective or a different approach for those hazards which require a bit more insight into the dynamical processes that drive them in the atmosphere, for example, for wind. So for that, we use regional climate models. These are much higher and they're much more granular in the information that they can provide. And we use a similar intercomparison project called the Coordinated Regional Downscaling Experiment for those data. For flooding, there's very much different models that need to be used because it is a much more, in many ways, much more complex hazard to represent because there's a lot of different features that we need to understand in more detail. So for example, for riverine flooding, so fluvial flooding where rivers overflow their banks, we use as a kind of primary driving force is the intersectoral impact model intercomparison project, which is a bit of a mouthful. But these are hydrological models which essentially incorporate additional processes related to the hydrological cycle of the water cycle in comparison to those kind of out-the-box global climate models. So these hydrological processes are very critical to the likes of riverine discharge. Similarly, for coastal flooding, we leverage the coastal or the chronic sea level rise information from the synthesized IPCC AR6 sea level rise dataset. So this is a very advanced dataset that takes into account, glacier melts, ice sheet melt, and that kind of expansion of water due to the increasing heat. So there's a lot of different data sets that go into this, and this is where this framework comes into play, as it essentially stitches all these together like a patchwork quilt to give you that perspective of what is the actual value that I need to worry about. What is for, if we're taking coastal flooding, for example, what is the combined effect of that chronic sea level rise with extreme sea levels, so the extreme height of the sea that you would expect associated with the likes of storm surges. So there's a lot of different data sets that go into it, all of it stitched together so that you get that final kind of single source of truth, as I mentioned in the webinar, at the end of it.
Awesome stuff. Thank you, Gillian. We have another question as well from Will, and his question is, have you seen any clients try and use climate risk data to go on offense, take arbitrage positions in markets, etc., to try and make this foresight an advantage and not just minimize loss? So first and foremost, I think it's really important that climate risk, lots of people do focus on the risks. There are opportunities. It seems almost perverse to say so, but there are opportunities associated with climate change. And I think we have worked with a wide variety of not just financial to try and understand what I'm sorry, I might have lost connection there. Hopefully you can still hear me.
Okay.
Okay, good. But essentially the point is that yes, you can turn this around and you can assess to say that potentially this is an opportunity for us. It getting hotter, for example, in the south of England, we may be able to produce better wine or more wine here. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but that is an example of an opportunity. In terms of financial firms that we've worked with, no financial firm has taken this as an opportunity just yet, primarily because of the large numbers associated with the $130 billion mark that Alice mentioned at the top of the call there. It's a scary number to have a look at that. So they are primarily focused on reducing that risk. I don't know, Alice, if you've come across any financial firms that are using this as an opportunity.
Thank you, John. Just to add on to that, something I have seen is particularly when organizations are incorporating a transition risk element into their scenario analysis or their risk assessment, would be altering their portfolio to, say, for example, investing more into renewables or adjusting in that way. So as John said, obviously with the large numbers of losses from physical risk, that is a big concern. I've also seen, for example, in the Alps, I know that there's reduced snow impacting the skiing industry there, which obviously is something that could be taken into account into investments. But in general, on the ground, I've seen this primarily used with looking at opportunities with transition risk.
Thank you, Alice. And we've got one more question from Sebastian. Can EarthScan also take climate change adaptation solutions into consideration for taxonomy alignment assessment? So with regards to the EU taxonomy, the way in which it works is we take into account the nature of your built asset, and then we apply our 11 different aligned risk hazards. There are one thing to mention about the EU taxonomy is that there are potentially superfluous risk hazards mentioned. So then that really is dependent on your industry. But I would like to suggest that for the majority of the assets assets that are being looked at by financial firms, saline intrusion or soil degradation or potentially even glacial lake outburst, these are named risk hazards in the EU taxonomy that will affect a very small amount of assets by comparison to the effects that could be felt by heat stress in particular, but also floods and severe wind forms. In terms of adaptation solutions, we take into account undefended risk. We do not take into account defenses. Primarily, I've worked with EarthScan long enough to remember that customers that we've approached have wanted to see their undefended risk because they've seen climate change already taking place in for example, the ferocity of storms felt by Hurricane Sandy in New York or Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. These are examples where defenses which were already in place have been overwhelmed, and that's what they want to understand. I don't know, Gillian, if you wanted to add anything else to that answer.
Absolutely. This is a brilliant question. Thank you for asking. And yes, this is perspective on flood defenses is something that comes up regularly, as you can imagine, in terms of if I place X defense at X location, will that affect my assets' resiliency against potential flood events? And to John's point, it is very much taking the approach of that undefended flood risk so that you can have a perspective that enables you to be maximally resilient against what could happen. Because something to remember about flood defenses, I suppose two things actually, is one, that they have a lifetime. They're not going to be there forever. And we are very much looking at very long-term timelines into the future. So unless they are maintained, which could be an assumption, the influence of those defenses may degrade over time. So by looking at undefended flood risk, you're essentially taking the perspective of what would happen if my flood defenses failed. And the second point is that these flood defenses are built to sustain a certain type of or a certain magnitude of an event. So for example, it might be a 1 in 200 year flood event, but you can have more severe, less probable events. You can have higher return period events. And these extreme examples are potentially going to increase in probability, thereby bringing them down into perhaps a 200 or 100 year event in future. So we need to be aware of these limitations of those defenses. So taking that maximal resilience perspective as a first step is very much the kind of preferred option that we've seen from our customer engagements.
Absolutely. And we just had another question actually from Angela, and Angela has asked, it's been mentioned that depending on the hazard to evaluate, data from GCMs/RCMs are used? Is any downscaling technique applied either on CMIP6 or Cordex for asset assessments? Gillian, I think this question is tailor-made for you.
It is. Thank you very much. And this is a wonderful question again. Thank you. And this, just for everyone else in the room, the spatial resolution we're talking about is a consequence of the way that climate models work. So they are very large pieces of computer code, which essentially discretize the Earth into boxes. And these global climate models that I mentioned, so those that are part of those couple model into comparison projects, some of those grid boxes can be in excess of 100 kilometers in size. So that is very coarse, and it's too coarse to be making actionable decisions based on that information. So to your point, downscaling that information and refining that and increasing the granularity of that data is critical for being able to make that next step. So downscaling can happen through two key pathways. I'm not going to go into the details, but there you can have statistical downscaling or dynamical downscaling. And I would say that the resolution of EarthScan's hazard information is grounded in two key guiding principles. So the first being, what resolution does the hazard actually require to be decision useful? So giving an example here, we've just been talking about flooding. If we're looking at a global data set, which of course EarthScan can provide, you really want to be looking at sub 100 meter spatial resolution for flooding signals. And that is, as I say, a riverine flooding signal is provided at 90 meter spatial resolution worldwide to essentially accommodate that, because this is a very localized hazard, which of course has a very direct link to the topography, to the terrain. And we know this from our lived experience of flooding. So take me, for example, I live in the Midlands in the UK, and basically my 100 meters down the road was flooded for me over the past couple of weeks, which was unfortunate. But if I had that information at a much coarser spatial resolution, that wouldn't have been decision useful for me. As mentioned, there was two principles. The latter is, what spatial resolution does the science actually indicate that we can confidently represent? So this goes back to what I'd mentioned in the webinar, in that science knows a lot. Scientists know a lot about how the climate is going to change and how different processes in the atmosphere linked to the land surface, to the ocean, to the cryosphere. There's a lot in there, but there's a lot that we don't know. So providing a more granular perspective on certain hazards may not necessarily be backed up by the science. And this is where the climate science expertise that sits behind EarthScan really comes into play. So we are there to essentially say, yes, this is we can confidently downscale to X meter resolution in this hazard. However, in this other hazard, say flooding, for example, we can go further because we can have more information. We can build more different data sets into that equation to give us that representation, that granularity. So it very much depends on what resolution the hazard actually requires. Flooding requires high resolution, but for example, the likes of drought, that's a very large scale meteorological phenomenon. So that's not going to change significantly from one 100 meter grid box to the next. However, for the example, for the likes of flooding, that granularity is absolutely required.
Awesome stuff. Thank you, Gillian. And I think we've answered all of the questions that have come through to us. And I think it remains for me to say two final things to wrap up. First of all, obviously, thank you for joining us today. We encourage you to join as many of the Verdantix webinars as possible. They do provide a fantastic insight into the world of ESG and sustainability. I couldn't recommend them highly enough. And secondly, if you wish to understand more about Matiga Solutions, EarthScan, or how climate change will affect your assets, please feel free to book a personalized demo in the link that has been shared in the chat. But from me, thank you very much for your attendance and for your attention today. I really appreciate everyone here who has joined to understand a bit more about how climate risks will affect them. Hopefully, we'll see you soon. Thank you now.